Well, before I start, I want to give many thanks to Cindy for 5 great blessings, and probably the reason I'm here before you today on Father's Day. A close friend in college, one who's since passed away, told me if I ever gave a sermon in the pulpit, he would listen to it. Difficult as it was to believe at that time that such an occasion would ever come to pass, I'm also thinking of him today. And I was especially struck by Nancy's Mother's Day message, and it still resonates with me. I myself spent nearly 40 years as a guidance counselor, and just after I graduated from graduate school and right before I began that professional journey, my father died. So my awareness of grief and loss was certainly heightened for those children, as Nancy explained. And each child's concerns, as I tried to listen to them and understand them and maybe help them, touch my core as well. So it's kind of hard to follow that Mother's Day sermon, but I'll give it my best go. A lot of this is going to be about history, so you're going to have to bear with me for those of you who don't like history. That's just the way it's going to be today. And when we're talking history, we're talking when someone's gone 70 years, there's a lot of history. But in the mid-'70s, a year before Cindy and I were married, I left a position as a road salesman for Schenck Athletic Equipment Company. It was then in Lemoyne on Market Street and run by Clarence Schenck. And he might be a little older than most of you, but he lived maybe a block away from here, and his brother Bob. And I went back to school to become a school counselor. To pay the fare for that endeavor, because I couldn't rub 2 nickels together, I accepted a position as a graduate assistant in the athletic department at Shippensburg State. It was a few years after Rob Kaufman's brother-in-law, Rob Carolus, held the same spot. And it was during that time in graduate school in April of '76, I had the good fortune to listen to a West Point graduate, Pete Dawkins. He was a halfback and captain of the undefeated 1958 Army football team, as well as an All-American, Heisman Trophy winner, and give an address to the college athletes at a banquet in Shippensburg. If you don't remember that 1958 season, Army beat Penn State 26-0, and they finished undefeated. As a speaker, Dawkins was an imposing figure, but more impressive was how he delivered his speech. He did the whole thing, his whole lecture without ever looking at his notes. And I was so impressed that afterwards I went up to him and said, "How did you do that?" Because he talked for a long time. And he said, well, he learned early in his life that when he was going to speak to people, he was just going to speak. He wasn't going to look at notes. He was going to try to speak from his heart. And so he memorized everything. I was intrigued by the stories he told that day, but most intrigued by a story he told of an underclassman on that team, a gentleman who became captain the next year and an All-American himself. His name was William Stanley Carpenter, Jr. Carpenter introduced the position of lonely or lonesome end to football, and for when he was the year before, his junior year, when they were undefeated. And you might not have ever heard of a position of lonely end or lonesome end, but simply while the other players huddled up for the play, he stood way out of the huddle and got his signals from the quarterback as to what was going to happen. And I've always thought that's an interesting concept. So 7 years later, after I heard that speech, I was asked to be a speaker at a St. Joseph's Youth All-Sports Banquet. And I worked really hard to really diligently on what I thought would be a meaningful message to the parents and the kids. I came up to the dais with my 3x5 cards and pretty confident in what I had to say. But after a couple minutes, I looked around the room and I realized, as was explained last week in detail by Don Potter, that not many people were listening to what I was saying. So I ditched the cue cards and began just talking from my heart. And afterwards, a good friend of mine came up to me and said, "You know, that was one of the best speeches I ever heard after you put the cards down." So from that time, I've always tried to not talk from notes, which I'm doing today. Try to take my cue from General Pete Dawkins. But not until I personally uncovered the backstory of Dawkins' teammate, Carpenter, did I begin to understand how it all fit together for today. William Stanley Carpenter Jr. was born in South Jersey, in the community of Woodbury, in September of 1937. My father, also a native son of Woodbury, was a sophomore at Woodbury High School at that time. 8 years later, Carpenter's father, William Stanley Carpenter Sr., enlisted in the Army and joined the infantry. Tragically, 1 month later, on April 11th, 1945, William Carpenter Sr., part of the 3rd Army, he was in the 309th, 93rd Infantry Regiment, 99 Infantry Division, part of the 3rd Army commanded by George S. Patton, was killed in Germany. His son was not yet 8 years old. My father, working his way through Drexel, went through officers' training. He also passed through New Cumberland on his way to the European theater in late 1944. His Black Hawk Division, which was transferred to the 3rd Army under Patton, a couple days after the elder Carpenter paid the ultimate sacrifice for our country. A week after Patton took command of my father's 86th Division, a reconnaissance mission of the 1st Division was ambushed by snipers in south of Munich, Germany. The S1 in charge of the mission was killed and another officer seriously wounded, and my father went to the lead vehicle and assumed command. I know these facts not because my father told me, but after he passed away, I went to Sweetland, Maryland, and tried to figure out what had happened because I knew he had a silver star in his mementos, but I didn't know what any of that meant. I knew when he got recalled to the 101st Airborne, he went in the Korean War, and that's when I was born, but I didn't know there's other things. But let me get back to William Carpenter Jr., because after his father died, his mother remarried and they went to Springfield, Pennsylvania, where he became probably one of the best athletes that Springfield High School has ever had. He pursued and obtained an appointment to attend the military academy at West Point, and his junior year on the football team, he introduced the lonesome end position to the nation, an outstanding story from that outstanding football season. And despite his commitment to the service in the Army after graduation, he was drafted by the Colts and the Bills in the AFL, but not before he was asked to play lacrosse and became an All-American in that sport too. Young Carpenter went on to serve 2 tours of duty in Vietnam in the 60s, awarded a Silver Star for heroism in combat in his first tour. His actions as an infantry captain for the 101st Airborne during the second tour were even more remarkable, especially at Dak To, where he saved his men by calling for a napalm strike on his own position, enabling his troops to set up a defensive position and escaped. I talked with a former basketball player and graduate of Dickinson College last weekend, who also graduated from Springfield High School, and like Carpenter, is also enshrined in the Springfield, Pennsylvania Hall of Fame. He said he knew General Carpenter, and he could get his contact info to me, and I'd be able to talk to him, but he added, he's kind of funny about all that. He doesn't like to talk about those days. And that was just a really familiar ring for me. I find these 2 coincidental circumstances, centered around the hometown of my father, remarkable. And I might add, my father-in-law was a decorated Marine fighter pilot in the Pacific Theater during World War II. He also experienced the trials of war. Personally, the significance for me of these stories is the grace these future fathers displayed afterwards. The version of the Bible I received 60 years ago from my church in my hometown of Chagrin Falls, Ohio, was the Standard Revised Version. In our second reading today, according to that version, in verse 2, James said, "Count it a joy, my brethren, when you meet various trials." In verse 14, he said, "Blessed is the man who endures trials." But is it necessary to go through these trials in war? In the early days of our denomination, the answer to that question was Often a resounding yes. And here's where I'll explain myself. I'm a big history buff, and my Bachelor of Arts is in history from Dickinson College, a school begun in the late 18th century by Presbyterians. While there, I took a special interest in courses by a professor who did a lot of British history courses. And so when I had an opportunity to travel to England and visit my older brother on sabbatical in Nottingham a couple decades ago, I jumped at the chance to pursue this avocation of mine. Anxious to visit the historical sites, I rented a vehicle and chased all over that island, taking in much of the British countryside, perusing archival libraries and town records. I also planned to summit Ben Nevis in Scotland, the highest point in Britain, as I enjoy hiking mountains. On the way to Ben Nevis, I motored through the Scottish Highlands and happened upon the monument to Bonnie Prince Charles in Glenfinnan, where he landed on the shores of Loch Shiel. I explored all around this area. I was intrigued by the whole thing. And when I returned to Pennsylvania, I read all I could about King George II and his son, Prince William Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland, and his victory over his cousin, Bonnie Prince Charles, the young Stuart pretender to the crown in 1746. The impact of all that for us here is we live in Cumberland County, and the reason it was named was because of that victory in Scotland at that time. And when the Duke of Cumberland vanquished his rival Highlanders in that battle, he gave no quarter, which means that he pretty much slaughtered everyone on the battlefield. And the Scots-Irish that were in Pennsylvania, who were once the lowland Scots, were overjoyed at the total defeat of their old Highland adversaries, as were the English. Historical context defines that moment for the Scots-Irish, and that's really what I wanted to talk about today. So let me back up a little bit. In 1560, July 10th, it says, there was a decree from Parliament that the Church of Rome was no longer the national church of Scotland. John Knox, who had been formerly imprisoned for his faith and a colleague of John Calvin, viewed the reform of our church as the will of God. The Presbyterian Church then became the established Kirk, or Church of Scotland. Knox was vindicated for what he believed, and Presbyterianism grew quickly. There was a fierce loyalty to Presbyterianism at that time among the adherents of it, which were the people from lowland Scotland who lived just north of the border between England and Scotland. Some have suggested that Calvin made the Scots tough, but it was probably Scottish character that made Calvinism. Known for their durability and hardness, what many people call a dour people by nature, the Scots believed individual rights are worth defending. The lowlander was, and still is, thought to be notoriously argumentative. Their national motto is, "No one attacks me with impunity." Especially at that time, the Scotsman was quick to take offense, lest any man think him a weakling. Even my surname, Thompson, that comes from the lowlands in Scotland, has on its coat of arms, "I wish for a fair fight." It could also be translated, "I want a good war." In the couple hundred years before 1600, people who visited lowland Scotland saw that there was lawlessness and violence and a seemingly addiction to fighting and violence. There were constant wars between England and Scotland. Queen Elizabeth's sister, Mary Queen of Scots' son, James VI, King of Scotland, who became James I of England in 1603, when Elizabeth died, made a common ruler for Scotland and England, and it was the beginning of the Stuart monarchy. For several reasons, which I won't belabor at this point, the mutual dislike of the Highland Scot for the Lowland Scot was pretty much a constant throughout all this period. And the Irish, who are very much like the Highland Scot in a lot of ways, have been contentious regarding England's rule over them for hundreds of years. Unlike Scotland, there was no Calvin or Knox in Ireland to usher in the Reformation. Jesuit missionaries held sway there. And when a couple of influential clan leaders in the north of Ireland, the Ulster province, were defeated by the British around the time of the death of Queen Elizabeth, the holdings of the land in the north of Ireland were soon escheated to King James in a feudal manner. King James VI of Scotland, then also James I of England, was passionate about Scripture. It was one of the legacies of his reign, the King James Bible, things like that. But he was also a patron of the arts. Shakespeare penned Macbeth as a shout out to the Scottish background of his benefactor and close friend, King James, after he ascended the throne. Rife with biblical imagery, Macbeth was about a leader in Scotland hundreds of years before King James, one so worried about losing his throne that he was willing to kill his best friend if he had to maintain his power. There's a strong parallel between the lectionary reading from the book of James and the theme of Shakespeare's Macbeth. But King James, because he felt the representative system of the Presbyterians was a danger to the crown of England, attempted to will Anglicism upon the Scots. And at the same time, he wanted a solution to what was considered in England the Irish problem by offering those former lands he had acquired in the Northern Ireland provinces. The lowland Scots, seeing this offer and noticing a good bargain, jumped at the opportunity to take advantage of free land in which someplace that was not really very far away. And the Ulster plantation that King James established in Northern Ireland, settled by the Scots immigrants through the 17th century, was comprised of these lowland Protestant Presbyterians, tenant farmers relocating for better land and less persecution of their faith and their kirk, which was the Presbyterian Church. The exodus of Scots to Northern Ireland occurred when religious zeal was probably at its peak in Scotland. The actions of King James, in essence, placing lowland Scots Presbyterians in Northern Ireland, and the resultant clash of two disparate cultures now on the same land, produced the backdrop and difficulties between Ulster and the rest of Ireland that our own Norman Hamilton is dealing with today. Those Scots carried to the Ulster province a heritage founded on defending themselves and their holdings during border wars with England and raids from the Highlanders in the north and those on the English border in the south. Once in Ulster, the Presbyterians gained their reputation for their pioneering skills, self-sufficiency, and their tenacity in defending their homeland. They also gained a reputation for self-governing through the structure of their kirk. The Presbyterians who remained in Scotland after the initial surge of tenant farmers who emigrated to Ulster, from there to Ulster, swore an oath that they would not accept the Church of England as their church. They were known to wear a red cloth around their necks. Many signed the covenant in their own blood in recognition of the physical risks they took just in living in England and being Presbyterian. These covenanters were called rednecks, a name that would follow all Presbyterians even into the American colonies. Under severe persecution for practicing their faith, the Covenanters fought bravely but unsuccessfully against English rule in Scotland, and many of them also fled to Northern Ireland about 50 years after it was first opened. And near the beginning of the 18th century and after the death of the Protestant William III of England, the rents on the lands of the Scots Presbyterian in Northern Ireland were driven a lot higher. There were severe droughts in the Irish countryside, and there was an increased persecution of the kirk in Ulster in the form of the Test Act, and I won't get into that, but it required all office holders in Ireland to take the sacraments in accordance with the Church of England, not the Kirk of Scotland. Scots-Irish Presbyterians did not tolerate subservience, so something had to give at that point. And at that time in America, Cotton Mather, the famed New England Congregationalist, thought that such a settlement by a culture that was that bellicose would provide a buffer between the raids from the French and the Native Americans. But the Congregationalists drove the Covenanters into what was now New Hampshire because they were themselves intolerant of a different religion. Pennsylvania, back in the Scots-Irish, was a much more tolerant environment. And this is where our Presbyterian forebears come into the picture. Mostly because of the emigration to America, the Presbyterian population of Ireland declined by one half between 1718 and 1775. Once here and in Pennsylvania, the Scots-Irish pushed to the frontier of the European settlement in Penn's territory, which is right here. Our rich Cumberland Valley became what historian Wayland F. Dunaway described as the seed plot and nursery of the Scots-Irish race, and therefore the Presbyterian religion. So really, the Presbyterians, the Scots-Irish who came to this country, really settled right here in the Cumberland Valley. Less than 2 decades after the Duke of Cumberland was victorious in Scotland, the relations between the Scots-Irish Presbyterians, the frontiersmen, and the Native Americans were pretty volatile. And it was at that time probably one of the worst parts of our history happened when an elder in the local Paxton Presbyterian Church led a group of men to massacre women and children, Native American women and children in Conestoga, Lancaster County. Those Paxton boys then marched on Philadelphia afterwards to eradicate peaceful Native Americans who were being held safe in that city. They enjoyed wide justification for what they did. Those and similar actions against what was then represented as a savage culture were remarkably similar in many ways to how the English had depicted the wild Irish a few centuries before. Justification for the devastation of the Irish by England during Queen Elizabeth's reign was more palatable to the general public as England was able to depict their rivals as savages or heathen or somehow not up and culturally to them. After their settlement in central Pennsylvania, many Presbyterians expanded their migration southward down the Blue Mountain Range, causing some historians to speculate that our own Civil War was a battle between northern and southern Scots-Irish, who had by that time become two separate cultures, but by nature and at the core were always ready for a good fight. But this isn't really saying anything new because all of history is replete with clashes of race and culture. And they're not all confined, certainly, to the Presbyterian denomination. A couple things that I found as I was doing some research on something else. In central Pennsylvania in the late 1920s, a Dickinson College graduate and mainstream Methodist minister in Mechanicsburg, the state chaplain of the Patriotic Order of the Sons of America, was a principal speaker for several rallies of the Ku Klux Klan in northern York County. That minister was also the speaker for a Memorial Day celebration in York Springs in 1926, when a parade of nearby clans marched, including those from Mechanicsburg, Carlisle, and Harrisburg. The parade started from the Presbyterian Church in York Springs. And in 1928, this is a story that I uncovered from a newspaper in Camden, New Jersey. A South Jersey glassblower named Oliver Fowler railed against the Klan taking over the pulpit, kind of like I am today, in the Glassboro, New Jersey Methodist Protestant Church, adorned with their white robes. Fowler said about them in an editorial in that Camden paper, "The Klan is stirring up a dangerous racial and religious prejudice. Any organization, no matter how Christian it may be in its principles, is not Christian in its fruitage when it suffers intolerance rather than tolerance." Our Presbyterian heritage comes from a collective unconscious and national identity in Scotland and from a people with a fighting nature, quick to take offense. I guess I've said that enough times. But what is our Presbyterian character today? That's all in the past. What is it today? As the Franciscan friar Richard Rohr puts it, how might we be complicit in the social events that permeate our lives? I interpret that question to ask my own question. Are these social events part of our trials? The expression, the first will be last and the last will be first, was heard in the lectionary from Matthew. It was also quoted in Matthew, "It is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven." In other research I did, I found a guy named John Woolman, who was an abolitionist, a Quaker abolitionist from South Jersey. And he thought that the pursuit of wealth in any form tends to make one, in his tract, A Caution to the Rich, the pursuit of wealth tends to make one a slave to the selfish spirit, which I found an interesting statement. Because our Presbyterian character should be about our spirit. It shouldn't be centered around money, power, or might. Our church recently decided to partner with 11 other churches in the area in a Messiah College program called Thriving Together. Roger Hummel, Nancy Conklin, and I will represent CHPC in this endeavor. The initiative is spearheaded by Dr. Drew Hart. Many of you in the congregation, I know, are already familiar with his work. He was quoted as saying about Thriving Together, "In the middle of our partisan, polarized, and racially divided society, we need churches committed to coming together to understand how we can thrive together across racial divides." I'm personally hopeful that this initiative will be productive, not only for the continued growth of our Presbyterian character, but just maybe for our entire region. I'm really excited that we'll be part of it. In an insert in the bulletin, you'll find the entire liturgy that Dr. Hart had us commit to as he introduced Thriving Together. I encourage you to look it over. It speaks to the mission of the program. And I'd like to end this history lesson with Dr. Hart's final question in that liturgy. What does the Lord require of us? And as you can read there, he says, and our response was, to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God. Amen.